Okay, so we're ready to go here, and I just want to outline what subjects or topics we'll be covering in the workshop this afternoon. So I need to deal with first what is a bee, because there is a great deal of confusion for people who aren't used to insects or bees in particular. When they go and look in the gardens or out in the bush, they will see something and they'll think, oh, is that a bee? So we're going to deal with that. And I was asked if I can cover the life cycle stages of the bee and some of their general biology. It's very diverse and it's hard to summarise, but I'll do my best to just give you some brief insights into bee biology. And then for identification, we're going to have to look at the morphology of a bee, the structure of its body and appendages and so on, and we'll focus in on those things which are important in making identifications. So that's both classifying them in the family level and identifying them right down to species. The process of identification, I'll just sort of guide you through that, and I'm going to be giving you plenty of opportunity to ask questions. And I should say from the outset that I've been buzzing around like a blue-banded bee lately and not sleeping well at night, and I've noticed that I'm saying things back to front. So if I don't make myself clear, please pull me up, stick your hand up or yell out and say, what the hell are you talking about? So in identification we would start big, work through what families there are. There are 5 families we're going to look at, and then we can consider some of the really large genera which you may get to know quite easily. There are 58 genera all up, so you can't get to know all of them this afternoon, but you might get to know at least some that are perhaps more outstanding. Now I can show you some particular bee species that are outstanding, so you might learn 1 or 2 of them. And apart from slides, I brought along a display box with some bees in, so perhaps I could start that circulating if people would just like to glance at a sample of bees, showing you pretty much the smallest right through to the largest of the Australian bees. And I need to tell you a little bit about what resources are available to you to help you if you do want to do more in learning about bees and identifying them. So I'm not the only one who's produced a book, and you might have seen some other books there up the top there. So at the end I'll perhaps bring them here and I can talk to you about those and other things. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. For most people, their concept of what a bee is based on the European honeybee, which is an introduction to Australia. So we know its general appearance, and I think most people know that it's a highly social bee, that they live in large colonies, and sometimes they go wild. So this shows you a bee, shows you a nest of a honeybee where they make it without constraints. So a hive is actually a man-made structure that we provide for bees to build their colony in. So that, I wouldn't call this a hive. Not so fast. I'll let you know when I want to go to the next one. Thank you. Yeah. So a colony consists of a queen. So the queen is a female that lays all of the eggs, and she produces lots and lots of daughters, which all of the daughters are sterile unless the colony needs some more queens. But those sterile daughters are the workers, so they don't produce eggs, and they're subservient to the colony, and they all have the same genes, the same genetic makeup. And in these social bees, we know that if we go too close to one of these, what's going to happen to us? We get stung, that's right. And often people say to me, I got bitten by a bee. But that's another thing that I want to clarify. You get stung, and I'll show you where you get stung from. So I think we're ready for the next one now. The only thing that you might confuse with honeybee honeycomb that we saw in the previous slide are nests of the paper nest wasp. So it's got the same hexagonal sort of pattern in the cells, but of course this kind of nest is made from plant fibres, dry plant fibres, hence the name paper nest. And the wasps that build them and live on them are predatory. So be warned that they're not bees. Now I want to talk about where bees came from and what they are essentially. Bees are an offshoot of wasps, and the wasp clan is extremely diverse. So they belong in the order Hymenoptera, which includes not only the bees but also the ants. And what do we know about ants? When you go and tread on the wrong kind of ant nest, we can get stung and bitten. So the sting is common to bees and wasps and ants, and it's in the tail. So here we have a number of different kinds of wasps, all of which sting prey into paralysis, and the prey, once paralysed, is either buried in a soil chamber or carried off to a specially made nest, and it provides food for the larvae. At some point in wasp evolution, a change occurred in one of the predatory wasps. We don't know quite how the transformation occurred, but it gave up its predatory ways and turned instead to collecting pollen and nectar as food for the larvae. So they still made nests, but instead of taking prey into the nest, they would take in loads of pollen and nectar, which when thickened we can call honey. Let's move to the next one, because I just want to talk about why it is that only female bees sting. Now I would loosely call this a wasp, but it's not a stinging wasp. It's a kind of wasp that you might see around here, you might see anywhere, even in the suburban area. It's a parasitic wasp, and it seeks out the nests of other wasps or native bees, and using this long appendage on the tail, it inserts an egg into the nest and maybe right into a brood cell of a host. And when the egg hatches, it turns into a little highly mobile larva which seeks out the host egg and kills it. And then the larva, the grub of this wasp, takes over the provision that has been provided by the host, be it paralysed insect or spider prey, or be it a bee that's provided pollen and nectar. So that's why it was an egg tube, but eventually there was another stage in evolution when at least one of those parasitic wasps changed in body form and became a predator, where it would catch and sting prey into paralysis. Now here's a picture of a bee abdomen which I've blown up. I've inflated it so that the segments have extended and the sting has been pushed out so you can see it quite clearly. There are a couple of little appendages that go with it. So there's a whole mechanism involved with the sting. There are muscles, there's a gland sac, and a tube which leads the venom into the base of the sting, and it goes through. There are several pieces to that sting shaft, but together they form a little channel that the venom travels down. So it's no longer used for egg laying. The eggs are laid from the base of the sting, just out of the end of the abdomen. Bees retain the sting for defensive purposes. Okay, thank you. So bees turn to collecting pollen, and if we see any insect that's bearing a load of pollen like any of these four, we know that it is a bee, and we know also that it is a female, because only females collect food and build and provision nests. So the two bees on the left are carrying pollen loads on their legs. They're carrying it in different ways. I'll deal more with that later. And the two bees on the right are carrying pollen loads under the abdomen. So they have special sets of hairs to do that, and the special sets of hairs, or one set, would be called a scopa. Thank you, Rob. Okay, now along with this change in habits, there was one morphological change which applies to all of the bees, and that is that they have branched hairs. The wasp ancestors, and all wasps, I think except a few, have just simple hairs. To see these branched hairs, you would really you'd need good magnification, say 50 to 100 times. So unless you've got a binocular microscope, I don't think you're going to see them. There are some strong hand lenses, but I tried before coming and I couldn't see branched hairs. But anyway, if you're really in doubt, have I got a bee or a wasp, because they look so similar otherwise, if you can get it under a microscope, the branched hairs tell you it is a bee. And they can have just one or a few branches on the shaft, or they can have many. In some cases they're quite feathery, and they produce felt-like areas over some bees which look like markings. Okay. Now, the ancestral bee had much the same sort of nesting habits as the wasp that led to it, and that was a ground nest. So this diagram shows you just a basic outline, a very simplified diagram of a bee nest and a ground burrowing bee nest. So bees burrow into the ground, and I might just deviate here a bit. There are many kinds of insects which are burrowing. Think of mole crickets and sandgropers. There are some scarab beetles, many scarab beetles are burrowers. And all of them, to aid them in burrowing, have well-developed front legs that are sort of spade-like, often with big spines. And it's easy to pick these as diggers. And so when the bees became ground nesting and were digging holes, guess what they got?
Shovels.
They didn't get big digging front legs. And I don't know why they didn't develop digging front legs, but their legs are just ordinary. So all of the bees tend to have pretty much the same leg structure, except often for males. So that's a mystery. How do they dig? Well, they use their mandibles, and we'll come to the mandibles a bit further along. They loosen the soil with the mandibles, and then they just scrape the soil up with the legs, and they get a load behind them and they bulldoze it up the burrow. So as they're going down, they're pushing loads up, and it comes out of the entrance hole and it just drops around the entrance to form a little volcano-like mound. Sometimes it can be, all off to one side, but generally if you see a volcano-shaped heap with a nice neat round hole, it's going to be a bee. Anyway, once the bees got down to a certain depth, so I've broken the burrow there so I don't give you the wrong idea, these burrows can go down metres in some cases, or they might be just a few centimetres. They burrow off to the side, and then they enlarge the end of the burrow to form a chamber, and that becomes a brood cell. So once they've finished the cell, they're happy with the construction of that, they begin collecting pollen and nectar, and they bring in several loads. They dump it in the brood cell, and once they've got enough material there, they then form it into a food mass. They will lay an egg on it, and then they will seal the cell and bring in loose soil to close up the access burrow. So those stippled burrows, ones that have been made before and closed off. Now, from that very basic kind of nest, all the other varied bee nests have evolved, and it's usually through a process of labour saving, or because of labour saving. Why go to all the trouble to make a special burrow and then backfill it several times when you can just make cells end to end. So bees started making cells in series. And eventually they moved out of the soil and they moved into other nesting places like holes in dead wood and so on. And they continued making cells end to end. So there was no digging. They might move into a ready-made hole, as in a bee hotel. And it's much less work, so they can make more faster. We'll move on to have a look at some brood cells. So top left there we have a brood cell that's been opened from the side to show you the provision with the egg on top. So usually they line the cell to make it waterproof, and so they use a secretion from glands in the abdomen, sometimes from glands in the thorax, and the secretion comes out of the mouth. So you can see how shiny that cell is top left, and that's because of the waterproofing secretion. Top right, it's a different bee brood cell there. We're looking down into it because it's added much more nectar to the pollen than the one on the left, so that it's very liquid, and if you were to tip the cell, the nectar would just pour out. But the egg is lying on the top. Am I getting feedback here? Sudden change of sound there.
Close to your face.
Keep it close, okay. With this cell here, I've taken off the cap and turned it over so you can see the inside, and in this particular case the bee has waxed the inside of the cap as well as the hole inside of the cell, and apparently they do that by leaving a little hole in the cap as they're making it, and they can stick their tongue in and wipe their waxy secretion around the inside, and then they close it up totally with another dollop of earth. As I mentioned, some bees use existing holes. So on the left we have the cell of a leafcutter bee with the egg showing on the pollen provision, and here we've got a resin bee which has used the burrow of some wood boring beetle, and I've chipped this open from a log. The entrance to the beetle burrow was just there, and the blind end up here. So resin bees collect resin and line the burrows with that. Okay, so the other life history stages. I guess everyone's familiar with the two kinds of development in insects. Is gradual development that we see in grasshoppers and cockroaches, where an egg hatches into a miniature of the adult, and that miniature, as it feeds, grows by stages. It gets bigger and bigger, and then eventually adds wings or little wing buds. But the bees are like butterflies and moths in that they have complete metamorphosis. So the egg hatches into a little grub and grows into a bigger grub in the cell. So you'll see a typical bee larva on the left there. It has no legs, it has no eyes, and the reason for that is it doesn't need any, because all bee grubs develop in a protected environment, in a nest, and usually in a closed bee cell. So it's dark and the food is provided for it. So all they need to have are mouth parts to eat the food. And eventually they eat all of their food and pass the waste usually in one mass at the end of feeding, and then they shed a skin and turn into a pupa. The pupa is very much like an adult in general appearance, except that it's got no colour, it's got very limited movement, they can just wriggle a little bit, but eventually that will shed its skin and produce an adult. Once a bee becomes adult, there's no further growth because it has a hard outer shell, and that does not grow. And the hairs on the body also do not grow, so they're not hairs in the same way as mammal hairs, where ours grow from a root. But there's it seems to me the sound is going off.
Yes, it is going on and off. Just keep talking, sorry.
I was doing that in the meeting last week.
Just recording separately, it's okay.
Yeah, okay. So, bees have pretty much the same body form as other insects. So the body has a head, thorax and abdomen, three major body divisions, and a number of appendages. They're always the same. The wings and the legs join to the thorax, which is the powerhouse of the insect. So the thorax is pretty much filled with muscles that work the legs and the wings. This green bee is one of Western Australia's very own, and it belongs in the family that occurs only in Australia too. But as for wings, there are two pairs of wings here, but it may just at a glance appear that there are only two, and the reason for that is that if you can go to the next slide, there are a set of little hooks that occur on the front margin of the hind wing, and when the hind wing slides over the hind wing, when the forewing slides over the hind wing, those hooks engage in a strong vein. And this coupling of the wings makes the wings more efficient, more aerodynamically efficient. So you get this wing coupling in many different kinds of insects. So butterflies and moths also have wing coupling, but they do it in a different way. And it's common to wasps as well. You might note there are hairy hind legs here, so this is perhaps fairly recognisable as a bee. So let's just deal with the structure of the head. This is a relatively hairless bee, and I chose this to illustrate some of the appendages so hair won't obscure things. Up the top of the head you'll see three little round objects. These are the simple eyes known as ocelli. They don't form images, but they are receptive to light, and apparently they're involved in the insect orientating itself to the horizon. We have the compound eyes on the side, which of course provide bees with their vision. And the antennae are typically elbowed, so we have from the socket a long first segment, a little segment, and then a long segmented part called the flagellum. Don't worry about these terms, but I'll be referring to this again a bit further along. There are a number of lines on the face which are actually sutures, so the cuticle is bent in and goes inside the head at those lines and forms attachment for muscles. But these lines divide up the face, and these particular plates can vary in size and shape and are quite useful.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you say the sutures like the fetal head, the bones go over? Is that?
Yeah, it's actually.
Is that what you were saying?
It was a gap, but either side of that suture, the cuticle turns in, and so it forms a sort of a hollow structure inside the head. So the nippers or the mandibles appear either side. They're quite useful in classification and identification. And this little flap on the bottom of the head, it's movable and it helps protect the proboscis. So we'll look now at the back of the head.
There's actually a pointer here if you want to do that. Just that red button on the top there.
Thank you. Good. And okay, so we're looking at the same bee's head, so we can see somewhat behind it, and we've got the proboscis, which is a complex organ, and it's jointed, and it can be extended and retracted at will by the bee. There's a cavity in the back of the head, so sometimes bees fold it back, and if you get a specimen, maybe if you get a museum specimen or a dead specimen, the proboscis is folded away and you can't see some of the essential features. So when I'm preparing specimens, I always try to poke out the proboscis and make it extend fully. But we'll say more about that presently. The legs are made up of more segments than our legs are, and don't worry about the names. except that you will recognise some names there, like femur. We have a long bone in our thigh, the femur, and we have a long bone in our shank, which is the tibia. Our tarsus has 5 parallel bones, but the bee's foot, the tarsus, is made up of 5 parts which are linear. So it's a very different kind of foot from a vertebrate foot, and so the terminology doesn't carry across terribly well. The first segment is usually the largest, and it's often modified in various ways, so it's been given its own name. Typically a pair of claws, always a pair of claws on the end, and sometimes a sticky pad. I don't know if you've ever noticed that bees can climb glass. If you put them in a bottle, they'll walk up the inside of the glass, and that's because they've got these little sticky pads between the claws. They work pretty much the same way that gecko feet do, where they can walk up walls and so on. Some bees don't have the sticky pads. Now the wing veins tend to be very constant in any particular kind of bee. In fact, they tend to be constant across bees and wasps, so that they've been given names denoting, in this case, the cells that the veins enclose, and the veins themselves have particular names, but we're not going to worry about that today. If you want more detail, you'll find them in the book. But the bits we do need to know about today, the leading edge of the wing has 2 strong veins, and then they end at the stigma. Oh, that's what I've got a pointer, Terry. The stigma is usually present, but it's lost in some bees, or it's reduced, and the cell that extends beyond it is termed the marginal cell. So the cells that occur behind it we call submarginals, and here we've got 1, 2, 3 submarginal cells. So they're useful in pinning down bees to family and genus and so on. Okay, now I need to talk about distinguishing the sexes, and here are the ways that you normally would do it. So the female characters on the left and males on the right. The antenna has 1 more segment in a male than it does in its female. So males have 13 to the females 12. And in that diagram where I showed you the antenna with a long basal segment, then a little one, it's that longer bit that's divided up into numerous bits. That's where the extra one occurs. That's where you need to count more carefully. Females generally have a sting, but there are some bees that have lost the sting, or it's become atrophied so that it's non-functional. You might be able to suggest some bees that don't have a sting that you've heard of. Anyone heard of stingless bees? Yeah, we don't have them in southern Western Australia. And they do occur up in the tropical north, across the top end and down the east coast. But there are the green bee, for example. That is one that does not sting. The female cannot sting you, nor its relatives. Oh, okay. So I had a.
No, sorry.
No, just. Yeah, we'll come to that. So males never sting you, but in place of the sting they have a genital organ, and I'll show you an example of a genital organ presently. But females, because they are the food gatherers, they usually, or at least in many cases, have a scopa, that set of hairs, or a special set of hairs for holding the pollen, and males never have a scopa. Now there are often other differences, so secondary sexual characters, just like in human beings, there can be other things that aren't really related to mating. I think with the next one we might cover. So that was to show you the flagellum. That we'll have an extra segment, we'll move on. Okay, so these are some structures out of the end of a male bee. On the left you've got the genital capsule. So it's a bilaterally symmetrical organ. They always tend to be much the same, with 4 appendages at the end. So that's used for copulating with the female. And often there are some plates, the lower plates of the abdomen at the end are highly modified and they're associated with that organ. They can be very useful in classification and identification too. But we don't need to worry about those. Okay, now talking of other characters, secondary sexual characters, on the left we have a pair of bees which are the male at the top and the female below, and you see how different their pilosity or the hair covering is between them. So you would think that they'd be different species for sure. On the right we have a species of masked bee, and they have facial markings, and usually they differ. The male at the top generally has more extensive markings than the female, shown at the bottom there. I forgot to put in...
Some water there?
Yeah, I don't know, the water clears up. I forgot to credit the photo to Bryony Fremlin. She did very well to capture this blue banded bee in flight. But the blue banded bee is perhaps one of the most familiar bees, and a lot of people nowadays know them. But this one is shown carrying a load of pollen on the scopa, which is located on the hind legs, both on the tibia and the base tarsus. We'll move along to the next. So here's a bee leg. It's not the blue banded bee's leg, but this bee would carry its pollen in a similar way, but it shows you the hairs without the pollen load. So they can be highly branched if the bee collects very fine-grained pollen, but if it collects very coarse pollen, then the hairs might be much simpler and much sparser. Sometimes the scopa is located more towards the base of the leg. Over there it's on the basal sections. And here's one of the stingless or sugar bag bees. They tend to carry the pollen in very discrete lumps, and they don't have very hairy hind legs. We'll have a look at the leg of this bee close up. They have what's called a pollen basket. That's the common term for it. Instead of lots of hairs, they tend to have a few stiff hairs, mostly around the edge, and the very smooth outer side of the leg is the plate against which the pollen sticks. The technical term for a pollen basket is corbicular. Now here are two bees that have the pollen beneath the abdomen. They don't carry pollen on the hind leg at all. So we'll move to the next. And there's an abdomen of, it's a leaf cutter, it's a resin bee which has scopal hairs beneath the abdomen, and they're all simple, not branched at all. If you find a female without a scopa, that may mean a number of things. It could mean that the pollen is carried in the honey stomach. The bees actually swallow it, and there are quite a few bees that do that. There are some large groups where all of the members swallow the pollen and carry it to the nest in the honey stomach, so it has to be regurgitated into the nest. Or it could mean, if that doesn't have an extra pollen load, that it is a cuckoo bee. And I had some cuckoo bees in the box that has circulated now. Instead of making their own nest, they find the nest of a host and they break into it, or just enter it if they can, and they lay their eggs in that nest, and their larvae take over the nest. So, if we're going to do a bee identification, we first need to ask, is the insect I'm dealing with a bee? Well, I note here that it's only got 2 wings. It doesn't have a proboscis, it doesn't have elbowed antennae, and only God, only one pair of legs. No, that's not a bee.
What is that?
It had just 2 wings. I suspect it was a fly. And someone pulled the legs off it. Okay, there are a number of flies that occur commonly in gardens and the bushlands which are often mistaken for bees. So top left is a drone fly. This is an introduced fly, but it mimics honeybees. And at the bottom we have some little hover flies. This is a magnified view of the same fly over there. We can notice that the antennae are knob-like and have a little bristle, so they're certainly not elbowed. And if the fly is still enough, you can make out that they've only got 1 pair of wings, and the legs are pretty different too in most cases. This one is still, so you can see that it has just 1 pair of wings. A very, very stiletto-like proboscis and very thin legs, so the same over here. But the furry bodies and the fact that they go to flowers often mislead people to think, oh, it could be a big bee. So, one of the other problems is distinguishing bees from wasps. And I don't know if any of you have caught an earlier talk of mine, but if you have, I want you to zip your lip, because I'm going to ask, can anyone distinguish bees from wasps in this set of images? You can have a guess which one might be a bee, and if you think any of them are wasps.
The one on the right.
This. Oh, shit.
Oh, that works now. I plugged it in.
Yeah.
I
I pressed the wrong button. Okay. The little one, that one there.
The one on the right, is that wasp?
I'm being tricky, of course, and they're all bees. Every one of them is a bee. So, how do you distinguish bees from wasps? And you've already got the answer. Well, you've got some answers, in fact, but not the wings, no. But if you had a stereo microscope and you could hold the thing down, what would you be looking for? Branched hairs. That's one thing. And none of them are carrying pollen, and the only one that might be carrying pollen is this one, and it is a female, so it's got pollen hairs, but it's not carrying a load. But all of these others, those bees that swallow the pollen and carry it back to the nest, I think that one is well, those 2 are males, that one's a female. Okay.
Oh, you can push the button on that now.
Oh, yeah. So the resemblance of bees and wasps becomes even worse when bees are mimics of particular kinds of wasps. Here we've got a potter wasp which makes nests of mud and collects caterpillars or preys on caterpillars, and here we've got a bee which does all the usual bee things, but its markings, if you notice the markings there and here, it's almost exactly the same. So there's a genus of bees, Hyleoides, and there are a couple of Hyleoides in the box. They mimic different kinds of potter wasps. Okay, so if we've decided that yes, we've got a wasp-like or bee-like insect and it's got branched hairs, so it must be a bee, the next thing we want to do is make sure we don't have a honeybee. So we've got to learn the characteristics of honeybees so we can rule them out. The wing will give us a good clue because it's very distinctive, and particularly the elongation of the marginal cell and the elongation of these 2 submarginals. If you compare with two native bees here, this is not so long and these cells are not stretched out to points. The hind leg, at least of the worker bees, is very distinctive. So like that little sugar bag or stingless bee, it has a corbicula. So it's not hairy, but it's got a fringe of stiff hairs along the outer margins, and the basal segment of the tarsus has a very distinct projection there. So usually just a glance at a leg, when you compare it with a typical bee leg there, if it's a female, that helps you say, no, honeybee. The face is very distinctive too, particularly the mandibles, which they have no teeth and they tend to meet on the midline, like so. There are details of all these features in the book, so if you're really keen you can refresh your memory there. Now the males of honeybees are known as drones. So here's a head of a drone, and the unusual thing about drones is that their eyes are greatly enlarged and meet on the top of the head, and it makes them particularly good at looking up at a bright sky and spotting virgin queens which go on their mating flights. And as a tennis player, I often lob a ball high and I see a swarm of drones come in and examine the ball to see, oh, what's this in my territory? But they don't stay on the ball very long. But none of the native bees have eyes that meet on the middle of the head. I just want to point out the way that wings can change between different genera and families of bees. So here's a wing with complete venation, and another one with complete venation. So we've got a well-developed stigma there, and all of the veins are strong. Now there's a change in this wing. We still have a stigma and that's all, but how many submarginal cells? Just 2, and they're about equal in size, but everything else is the same. Okay, we've lost something else here. So it's another one with just 2 submarginals, but we've lost a vein down here. Now this loss of veins tends to occur in smaller bees. It seems like very tiny wings don't need as much stiffening, but still they're useful in identifications. I think I mentioned at the beginning that we've got 5 families of bees, and they're listed on the left in white. And when we're talking about these, we often turn the scientific name into an adjective by just shortening it. So the family Caletidae, we can just call bees in that family Caletids. We're just putting an S instead of the AE. And Stenotritidae, those bees are Stenotritids, etc. Now the first major division we can make in the bees is to class them as either short-tongued or long-tongued bees. So we'll now progress to have a look at what I mean by that. And here's a short-tongued bee. The proboscis has been extended, and here is the tongue, viewed from the side and viewed from the back. We see that it's very short and obtuse, rather brush-like. And as well, we've got some little appendages here, jointed appendages, so 6 segmented there and 4 segmented there. So this form is typical of the short-tongued bees. So this is an example from the family Caletidae. We'll now look at a different family. And the tongue, viewed from behind, is pointed rather than obtuse. So halictids typically have a pointed, short but pointed tongue. It can be elongated to varying degrees, so that it becomes almost long enough to think, isn't that a long-tongued bee? But we've still got these little jointed appendages here, 2 pairs of them. So you've got to look both for the tongue and the little appendages. Just going back to this one, the third family, the Stenotritids, their tongue is somewhat similar, but instead of having a point, this is rounded off, so it's really just a short almost a knob-like tongue for the stenotritid. So to distinguish them from the others, the thing we need to look for is the antenna, where the third segment is greatly elongated, and that's characteristic of all stenotritids. That's a family restricted to Australia. Okay, now this is obviously a long-tongued bee, I hope you'll agree. It's related to the blue-banded bees, and over east people might want to call it a teddy bear bee, but I don't care too much for that name. Here is the tongue. It's a very mobile organ. The bees can move it around. It's covered with hairs, so it absorbs nectar in the flowers, and it can be retracted, but it moves up and down within a tube formed by some more appendages of the proboscis. So we'll split this up a bit so we can see how it's built. And we're looking at it from behind. So there's the hairy tongue. This is the base, and it's sort of curving down away. But what in the short-tongued bees are short little segments of 4 little segments there. They've become flattened and broadened, and they lie under the tongue. And then above there are some other organs that are greatly elongated and blade-like, and they form the top of the tube. So the tongue goes down this tube formed by these elongated organs. So all long-tongued bees have this structure. So there's all the lowdown on what sort of things we need to be looking for. And the